folks. So my name is Simon Bennetts, and I work for Mozilla, and I'm the project lead for the OWASP Zed Attack Proxy, and I'm here to talk about security testing with ZAP, particularly in continuous integration, continuous deployment environment. Now, before I get started, I've just got a couple of questions for you all. Has anyone here heard of ZAP before this conference? A few of you, great. And how many of you here actually do any sort of security testing at the moment? A few of you do, great. Mostly the ones who've already heard of ZAP, which is hopefully using ZAP. Now this is kind of an interesting presentation to prepare for because you're never sure who's going to turn up, particularly at events like this. So I'm going to try and start very basic, and it will get more complicated. But if you've got any questions, please, you can wait until the end, but if things are confusing you, just shout out and I'll try and answer them as we go along. So the plan for this talk is we'll talk about the problems we're trying to solve, and in particular, the problems we're not trying to solve. I'm going to try and make sure you can get something out of this, something that you can go and use immediately, because I know that security testing is non-trivial, it's kind of tricky, and there are a lot of gotchas. I'm going to give you an introduction to ZAP, because most of you here haven't heard of it, and I'm going to go to where to start, something you can take away and use straight away once you get back, and then we're going to go on to where you can go from there. So, the problems we're trying to solve. What we want to do is we want to find as many security issues as early as possible. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that the cost of solving any sort of issues, any sort of bugs, increases over time. So the later you find them, the more expensive they are. This is particularly true of security problems, and it can be very expensive for companies if security problems aren't found or are found by the bad guys. We also want to try and integrate things into the DevOps pipeline. It used to be the case we had long development cycles, but even then, security didn't tend to get considered early on. Security is often something that either wasn't considered at all or was considered too late. So sometimes you might have got some professional pen testers in to test your application, but it could have been like 2 weeks before you're supposed to go live. And then invariably they would find a load of problems, and you'd have this problem, do you actually put off the go live date while you fix those problems, or do you actually go live with known security vulnerabilities, neither of which is good. However, with the DevOps pipeline, all of the development lifecycle is much more compressed, and there's no way that many companies can afford to actually have a load of security people continually testing things all the time. Chances are, if you're working on applications that are critical to a company, you probably will need security people to come in and do pen testing. But if they find simple stuff that's late on, then that's a really bad sign. So what we want to try and do is find the simple stuff as early as possible, and if we find simple problems, then that's often an indication that actually we need to make some changes, and we need to, whether it could be more training or different processes, but at least you can identify those problems. So the things we're not trying to solve is finding all the possible vulnerabilities. Automation is good for finding particular types of vulnerabilities. So things like your cross-site scripting and SQL injection. There's quite a lot of automation which works well with those. But there's also a whole load of other types of vulnerabilities, particularly application-level vulnerabilities, where it's someone abusing the application logic. That's actually very difficult to automate. So we know we're not going to find all the vulnerabilities with automation. So you can be sure that pen testers aren't going to be put out of a job. So what I want to do is I want to give you a very quick way of evaluating your applications, and then I want to talk about other ways you can do more thorough, deeper scanning, and I'm going to give you an introduction to the ZAP API, which gives you a lot of control over ZAP and possibly isn't as well documented as it should be. So, ZAP. ZAP is a tool for finding vulnerabilities in web applications. Now, the key thing is, it's actually a tool for finding vulnerabilities in custom web applications. There are tools out there which search for known problems. So, say you've got a WordPress blog, and there are known problems with certain versions of WordPress. There are other applications which are good at finding those. They just look for particular signatures and go, yep, you're using an old version of WordPress, or whatever it is, therefore you're vulnerable. That's all well and good, and those tools are great, but what most of us work on, or a lot of people work on, is custom web applications. And finding vulnerabilities in those is much harder. So what we do, ZAP does a whole range of things, including doing lots of attacks and trying to work out what sort of vulnerabilities there are. So if you're writing custom applications, then web applications, then hopefully ZAP will help you. It is one of the world's most popular free security tools. I think the last version was downloaded 350,000 times, which is pretty good for a security tool. That doesn't mean we have 350,000 users, I'm sure, but it's quite a few users. It is completely free and open source. The whole idea with ZAP is it is a community project, and there is no pro version, there's never going to be a pro version, and part of the reason I say that is because we want people to get involved, and you can be sure if you get involved, we're not going to try and take your work and make money out of it. We want people to get involved and help make ZAP better. How many people here have actually heard of OWASP? Just most of you. That's great. When I started about 5 years ago, a lot fewer hands went up. For those of you who don't know, it's the Open Web Application Security Project. It's an organization dedicated to making application security more visible. It has conferences, it has local chapters, and it has projects. And it has different levels of projects, and ZAP is one of the flagship projects, so this is one of the projects that OWASP recommends is one of the best ones to get started with. So it's one of the most mature ones. And it is ideal for people new to security. My background is actually I was a developer, and I got involved in security because I had a pen test on one of my applications, and it found a load of vulnerabilities I'd never even heard of. So I actually wanted to get involved in security just to make me a better developer. And it turned, I tried to find a project to get involved with, couldn't find one, and ended up creating ZAP. So it was very much to help me learn about security, and that's a very important thing. I want to help other people learn about security as well. However, it was taken up quite early on by security professionals, so we've got this whole range of people who are completely new to security, right up to the hardcore security pros, and you can use ZAP in lots of different ways. One thing, it is ideal for developers, particularly with automated security tests, and it's actually one of the reasons I started ZAP, because I wanted to automate as many security tests as possible to make my life as a developer easier, and so that's one, and ZAP is particularly good at this type of thing. But it's important to say that in the security world, there are no silver bullets, therefore ZAP isn't one of them. So some features about ZAP. It's got a swing-based UI for desktop mode. So this used to be the only way you could run it. So we now started calling it desktop mode. But it has a very comprehensive API. So we added the API quite a long time ago to make it easier to automate. And the API doesn't quite cover all the features of the UI, but it covers all the features that we think are the essential ones for automation, and we're trying to cover the rest of them in time as well. It has a plugin architecture. This means you can extend it in lots of ways, and lots of people have extended it. And we have an online marketplace. We call it a marketplace, but all the add-ons on there are completely free. So you can download them from within ZAP, and you can automate the downloading of those as well. So the different add-ons, ZAP is actually made up of add-ons itself. So when you download ZAP, it includes a lot of add-ons. And the add-ons have different quality levels. So anything that, when we start off, everything starts with alpha quality, even ones written by the ZAP core team, then progress to beta and release. And even those add-ons which are release quality, we might not include them with ZAP by default, because we only want to include the add-ons that are kind of, we think will be most useful. And there are some add-ons which either the quality, they're too immature, or they might be too obscure for most people to use. So there's a lot of stuff on the marketplace which you can download and play around with. Now, one thing with security testing, one of the problems is how to explore an application. And this is actually quite key. If you don't understand how an application is structured, then you won't be able to test it very well. And exploring applications is hard. There are different ways, and I'll talk about them later, but we have two spiders. So we have a traditional spider, and the traditional spider just goes through all the links. So it analyzes the HTML and finds the links and follows those. And it's kind of fast and furious, but it doesn't handle JavaScript applications so well. For that reason, we have an AJAX Spider, and what happens is that actually launches browsers and gets them to click on and those browsers, and controls them by Selenium, and clicks on the elements. So that will be able to handle anything. It's just slower, because we're launching browsers and clicking on things rather than just following the links. We have what we call passive and active scanning. So passive scanning is where we look at the requests and the responses flowing through ZAP. And one of the key things is ZAP is an intercepting proxy, and typically the way you want to use it is you want to proxy traffic through ZAP. And what we can do is when the traffic that goes through ZAP, we can analyze it, and we can look for potential vulnerabilities. And passive scanning just looks, it doesn't touch. So we can determine certain types of vulnerabilities just by looking at the traffic. That's fine a certain set, but the fun stuff is the active scanning, and that's where we actually go ahead and attack the application in question. An important point, if you do use ZAP, please only use active scanning on applications that you have permission to test. Otherwise, you could be breaking the law. And I've told you that, and that's my get out of jail free card. One thing is, ZAP is highly configurable. We know that it's actually very difficult to cope with all the different types of web applications out there. There are loads of different things that people do, bizarre, weird, and wonderful things, and it's very difficult to make the ZAP apply as well as possible to all situations. We try and make it sensible, but it's highly configurable once for your particular application. And it is highly scriptable. So you can actually run scripts within ZAP, and those scripts have full permission to all of the ZAP functionality, all the ZAP's data structures. There's nothing's hidden. We're open source, we've got nothing to hide. But you can also script ZAP via the API as well. So it's very extensible and very scriptable. So, some ZAP use cases. We've got lots of different ways you can use ZAP. One of them is a point and shoot. You can use it as a point and shoot tool. So this is actually a good way to get started. You can just run up the ZAP UI, and you can give it a URL. What it'll do is it'll go off and spider the application by just using the traditional spider, and then it will attack it. And then it will just show you the vulnerabilities it finds. That's all well and good, but doesn't handle things like authentication. Another very effective way is proxying ZAP. So actually proxy your browser through ZAP, and you can explore it that way. So you can explore it manually. You can use the spiders as well, but if you're doing it manually, you probably will be putting in more sensible values, and you can actually focus on particular areas of the application rather than the whole application. Then there's a whole set of tools for manual pen testing, which I won't go into here, but there's a whole lot of fuzzing and things, so manual pen testers can really go into a lot of depth. And the important one, particularly for this talk, is automated security regression tests. So I'll talk about those a lot more later. I actually use it as a debugger. So if you've got a JavaScript library you're playing around with and something weird is happening with interaction with the server, you can actually put ZAP in between, and you can change things on the fly. And normally this is used for attacking things, but it's actually quite good just tweaking things and seeing what works and what doesn't. You don't have to go and actually change the code on the server and redeploy or anything like that. Just change it on the fly and see what happens. And you can also use it as part of a larger security program, because there's a lot of other tools that use that, both open source and commercial ones. So we have lots of different ways to install ZAP, which I'll make as easy as possible. We've got installers for all the main operating systems. We've got Linux patches, homebrew casks. But the ones I want to point out are the Docker images, because I don't know about you, but I'm a fan of Docker, particularly with automated testing. And so we actually have 3 different Docker images. We have the stable one, which matches the most recent official version of ZAP, which is 2.6.0 at the moment. We have a weekly version, so every Monday there's a new weekly release goes out, and you can download that as well as a Docker image. We have a live version as well, and that's basically the latest code that's been checked in. So if you're having a particular problem, let us know, and if we fix it, then an hour later you'll actually be able to try it out using the live image. So I'm now going to tell you where you can get started, because I know security testing can be a bit overwhelming and can be quite tricky to get into. We've got this thing called the baseline scan. And the important thing about it, it's completely safe. You won't break things, or if it does break things, then you've really got problems. It runs very quickly. It'll only take a couple of minutes for a site, which means it can be easily integrated into continuous integration or continuous delivery. And it's very easy to get started. So you need to do 2 things. You need to pull one of the Docker images. In this case, I've shown weekly. I like using the weekly one. And then you run that image, and you've caught with the ZAP baseline.py script, and you give it a target. And that's all you need to do. There are a lot more options, but that's how you can get started. And this means it's something that is very easy to include in your pipeline. So it only has one dependency, Docker. ZAP is written in Java, but of course that's all packaged with Docker. And what it'll do is it'll do a time-limited spider of the target. We limit the time because some applications can be massive, particularly ones that are data-driven. So Mozilla, we've got things like addons.mozilla.org, which takes about 40 minutes to spider and then many, many hours to active scan. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to have something that was very quick, so we limit the spider to 1 minute. You can still find 600 odd pages, something like that, depending on the speed of your application, speed and size of your application. And all it will do is passive scanning. That's why I say it's actually safe to run against your applications. Just making the request, it's just looking at the kind of the first few hundred pages of your application it finds, and then it warns you about the problems. And by default, it'll warn you about all the things it's looking for. You can actually include any ZAP command line option, and I'll explain why that's really useful later. And you can ignore specific regexes as well, so it's pretty configurable. And it includes all of the release and beta passive scanning rules. And so it will find things like missing security headers, problems with cookies, missing CSRF tokens, a lot of things which are actually really useful and really important. And you can optionally include alpha passive scan rules as well. That's the you just use the script without any option to give you the full list of parameters that will accept command line options. One down there is this ZAP options, which is particularly useful because you can set pretty much anything in ZAP via the command line. So this is a kind of summary of the output. Running against example.com, feel free to do that. And you'll get it'll tell you how many URLs it's found, then it'll tell you all the ones that pass, and then by default, it'll tell you all of the tests that fail, and it'll give you a summary at the end. So we can see at the bottom, we actually get 4 warnings and no failures. By default, it warns on everything. And what you can do is you can actually give a -G option, and that will generate a configuration file. And the configuration file will give all of the rules that are available, and will say that we're warning on them. And what you can do is you can just edit that with any text editor, change the warns to ignore or fail, and then that will change how the results of the scan. So that is actually very effective, and what you can do is you can include that in your delivery pipeline. So what we do at Mozilla is when we promote our applications from development to staging and from staging to live, we run this. And usually we start off by actually saying, well, these applications, we just want to report what's going on. But what we then say is, right, once we know what's going on, we fix the things that are most important, we can actually say, if this test fails, then we fail a promotion, or we generate warnings, or we raise issues. So you can actually say, right, we've got an application to a reasonable state, and from there on, we actually want to say, if this regresses, we want to know, or we want to actually fail it being promoted. And this is great. But one thing we found is that we didn't have this kind of overall picture. It was very useful on particular applications, but where, what does the world look like from this point of view? So what we've developed is what we're calling a mass baseline scan, and this provides a dashboard, and it allows you to go in to look at the detailed results and the service history as well. So we've got a repo, there's a ZA Proxy repo on GitHub, and there's community scripts there, and what you'll do is you'll get out this kind of summary, and by default it just pushes it to GitHub, so we have a private repo, and part of the Cloud Services team, we have something like 60 or 70 services in there, in a private repo, and if any of those fail, then actually issues get raised and assigned to me. So this is great. We can actually see where things are, and we can start delving into the particular problems. If something's changed, or we can look at the overall setup and say, right, well, this is a service we want to focus on and make better. So that's all well and good, but what that means is we're only looking for the things that can be found by passive scanning. Those aren't the really fun things. They're not the injection vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting and the like. So what you want to do is once you've actually got the basic passive scanning working, it's worth moving on to the full scanning. And we've got lots of different options for this. We're an open source project. We don't know how people are going to be using it. Obviously, we're using it in Mozilla, but we know people are using it in lots of different environments, so we can't provide plugins for every particular build environment that there is. So we've got some packaged options, but we've got a lot of flexibility as well. We have a command line quick scan, and that's actually just the same as when you bring up the ZAP UI, just typing in the URL. It's the same, but instead of launching the UI, it just runs it in line and does the same thing. It does a spider, and an active scanner reports the results. This may take significantly longer than the 2 minutes for the baseline scan. So I've done some scans which have taken like 10 hours. you can speed things up, and it's well worth delving into. In that particular case, the application was using generated content, database-generated content, so there's a lot of repetition, and you can configure ZAP to understand that, and then it'll scan things much quicker, but even so, it's going to take a significant length of time, so these are the kind of things you might well want to schedule once a week or something like that. We have a Jenkins plugin, which I'll talk about a little bit more, some scripts, and we've actually got a scripted API scan coming soon. So one thing we found is, particularly with modern applications, we're finding a lot of APIs in Mozilla, and so what we want to do is actually have an option for scanning from the command line where you just give the definition of the API. So whether that's using SOAP or Swagger, OpenAPI, just give it that definition, and then it will go and scan the API. So that's going to be coming soon, working on that at the moment. But we have the daemon mode and API, and that gives you complete flexibility. You can do pretty much anything you can do with the ZAP UI. And we've got something that's called ZAP as a service, which is in development, and it's taking a bit of a while, so got nothing to play with at the moment. So we have, I'm not going to demo the quick scan, but just you can invoke ZAP. We've got the shell for Linux and command for Windows, so you can just invoke it with the URL, and it will just show you the spider in the active scan, and that's nice and straightforward. But again, that won't handle the authentication or anything like that. We now have an official Jenkins plugin, and if you're using Jenkins, I can strongly recommend this. So that's a link, and the slides will be available later, but you should be able to find it. And this is maintained by the ZAP core team, and it supports authentication, scan policies. So scan policies are how we actually configure exactly which rules are used and the strength of those rules. That's the fine-grained support we talked about. It's got Jira integration, and so from the latest version, it supports the latest version of ZAP and all the weekly releases after that. Now, I'm not going to go into this in detail because I don't know how many of you are using Jenkins, so you might be using other build tools. We have what we call the SDLC integration scripts, which were very kindly donated by another company. And these are pretty much the same kind of thing as a Jenkins plugin, but I think it's pretty much Linux only. You could probably get them working on Windows with playing around with some scripts. But it does essentially the same thing, but from the command line. But before I go into the API in detail, I want to mention some useful command line options. And these are actually very useful for the baseline scan as well. Any way you invoke ZAP, you can specify options via the command line. So one thing we do with the UI is everything is stored in a database, which means if your machine crashes or heaven help us, ZAP goes down, you won't lose any of the data because it'll be in the database. But in automation, that's less important because if something goes wrong, you just try and fix the underlying problem and start again. So what you can do is you actually turn off the database recovery log. This speeds things up a bit. That's always good. You can actually make sure that we have options for updating all of the add-ons. One of the advantage of add-ons, and one of the reasons we're moving a lot of the ZAP core into add-ons, is we can push changes to the add-ons out at any point. We kind of do ZAP main releases 3 or 4 times a year, depending. But with a lot of the things, including the scan rules, they're all parts of add-ons, which means we can make a change and push it out at any point. So we've got an option which allows you to actually check that you're on the latest version of the add-ons and pull them down. And this is really great if you've got a setup where you're doing full scans of ZAP. You might be using the main release, and you haven't made any changes, but we could actually make some changes and improve the scan rules or add some new ones. And just by updating them, you'll then find vulnerabilities in your application that we didn't report before because we didn't have these changes. You can also install non-default add-ons by command line option, because there's a whole load of things. There's things like an add-on for detecting DOM cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. So you can pull those down automatically as part of automation as well. And you can do things like setting the API key or disabling the API key, which makes things a lot easier for automation, but you should only do that in a safe environment. How's everyone doing so far? Any questions? Okay, so what I want to do now is delve into the ZAP API in a bit more detail so you can see what's possible and how to understand it, particularly as the documentation could be better. So I'm going to give you an introduction to the API, talk about exploring, scanning, reporting, a little bit about authentication, and something about tuning as well. So the API it's not a real REST API, but it's REST-ish. So it uses gets and posts, doesn't use any of the other HTTP methods. That's kind of good because, well, in some ways, because we actually have a UI around it. So we can actually drive it via a very data-generated UI, so you can explore it a bit more easily. It actually maps very close to the user interface. And this is quite important because I think the more you understand the UI, the easier you'll understand the API. So even if you don't intend to use the UI, it's actually quite a good way to learn about the API. And it does interact with the UI as well, as much as possible, so you can actually use the UI as a kind of debugging tool. You can play around with that with using the API at the same time. So there's got a web UI for it, but we have clients in various languages. You don't actually need to use a client. You can just use curl or anything like that, or any tool which will make HTTP requests, really. But the clients we have are all generated from the code, which means it stays up to date and should be correct for everything, for all of the different operations. So what we'll do is actually, I will show you, get onto the demos now. So I've just got a very simple, vulnerable web application, which I'll be playing with a little bit. And this is the ZAP UI, which I'll just clear details. So it might look a bit complicated, but actually we're hiding a load of things. So one thing, there's loads of functionality. If you're playing with the API, around with the UI, do right-click everywhere, because there's whole loads of options when you right-click. So exploring, it's always worth playing around with things. I mentioned that quick start attack. There's the box there. Just put your URL in there and click attack. And what that'll do is it'll do the spider and then the active scan. So that's a nice, easy way to get started. What you'll find is if you actually go to the address and port that ZAP is listening on, then you'll get that welcome screen, and the first link is a link to the API. So this is all generated. And underneath there is all of the components, the ZAP components which support the API. So as I said, these components typically have equivalents in the UI. There's usually the same piece of code. It maintains the different, both the UI and the API. And as much as possible, the UI now drives the API as well. So what you can do is you can delve into any of these things. So we can have a look at the AJAX Spider, and all of the components can have views, and views just return information, and they can have actions which chain things, and in that case we haven't, but some of the others. Let's have a look at the core. We'll see that at the bottom there'll be things called others, which are return data in a different structure. So typically the views and the actions actually return data in a standard structure, which could be XML or JSON. We generate at that at the time, whereas the others return things in specific formats, for example, the HTML report there. So some tips I've already said. If you want to get to understand the API, definitely play around with the desktop UI. And one thing you can do is ZAP is very configurable, but we try to make it so you can configure everything from the API, but I'm not sure you'd want to. Some things, particularly context and authentication, it's actually much better to play around with the UI, because you can see what's going on, and you can tweak things and try things out. Once you've got it working in the UI, then you can actually export things. So the context is where we define all of the things, the data you put in relative to the application, explaining how the application works to ZAP. You can export that from the UI, and then you can import that file via the API. That is a much easier way to do things than try and configure it from the API from scratch. So play around with the UI, reproduce using the API, but actually with the UI running, particularly if you have any problems, because you can see what's going on, and finally just convert everything to a script. Do a quick introduction to the Python API. All of the client APIs work in pretty much the same way. So with Python, pip install, and you create a ZAP v2 object, and once you've done that, you can specify the API key that you want to use to talk to ZAP, and the proxies that you want to use. So that's the address and port that ZAP is using, and then you can open a target URL, and that proxies through ZAP. So one of the first things, I've already mentioned that exploring is key. Exploring is very important for security tools, because if we don't explore an application effectively, the tool won't understand it. If you have regression tests or unit tests that make HTTP requests, then these are actually really good. They're great, because hopefully your tests are actually testing your application the way you expect it to be used. This is really good, and the more thorough they are, the better, because you'll be supplying information that is kind of relevant. You might have some bad data in there, but usually that's testing error cases, but you'll have be putting in data which will explore your application, might actually open up more application functionality. So we'll be adding users and then doing things to users, or adding things with sensible values. This is great. This is exactly what we want within ZAP, because then we can use those and we can start abusing the good use case. So we can do all the security attacks on that good data. So if you have those, please use them. That is the best option. If you haven't got those, or if you don't think those are thorough enough, we've got the traditional Spider, which, as I mentioned, is fast and furious but doesn't handle JavaScript so well. We have the AJAX Spider, and that will launch browsers to click on things, and we support all the main browsers, including some of the headless ones as well. And actually, if you're running in the Docker image, then you can automate. It's got virtual frame buffers, so you can still use Firefox and Chrome and any other browsers you want, even though the ones that aren't officially headless, they'll still work in the Docker image. We can import API definitions, so we can import SOAP definitions and Swagger Open API definitions. And this is really great for exploring APIs, because typically APIs, if they haven't got these definitions, then you can't spider them, because there's usually nothing to spider. And we can import URLs, including mod security 2 logs as well. So what I'll do is actually show you the Spider. I'm going to start off by just going to ZAP, and there's lots of different ways you can do this, but I'm going to go to the Spider tab, to New Scan. So what you'll see there is ZAP did a very quick spider of the application, the test application, and underneath here you'll see all of the URLs that we found. So we have the kind of all the requests available down here, and on the left-hand side we build up this hierarchical sites tree, so you can see which is just another representation of the application. You probably won't be able to see these fuzzy kind of things, are little spider icons, and so that's an indication that it was the spider that found it. So if you're actually doing manual testing, as soon as you visit that page manually, then that spider icon will disappear, so you can see which bits you found manually and which bits you didn't find for whatever reason, which is kind of useful. So I'm going to start a new session just to get rid of that. So blank again, and I'm going to go to the API UI and go to the top level and scroll down to the Spider. And we've got a whole load of views available. And we'll go down to Scan. And we've got various options. And if I actually bring up the UI again, you'll see starting point, context, user, recurse. And we've actually got things like max children, recurse, subtree only. So they're very similar kind of options. In this case, I will do the same thing. I have to say recurse is true, because the default is false. And if you keep an eye on the UI, you'll see there it actually did exactly the same thing. Now, what happened is we actually got an ID back. So one thing is, it did happen very quickly, but if it takes longer, what you can do is you can actually poll. There is a status here, so put the ID in, and we can see it's actually 100%, which is good. And there's a whole load of other views, so we can actually see the results. So there's the results. There's all the things it found. So as you can see, the controlling the Spider via the API is very similar to via the UI. And via Python, Again, scan the target, usually sleep for a little while just to let it get going, and then you loop around, polling the status until it gets to 100%, and then it's finished. Nice and straightforward. The AJAX Spider is very similar. We kick it off. In this particular case, it doesn't tell us how far it thinks it's got. It just tells us whether it's progressing or not. So we just check to wait and see what it says it's running. It carries on, and when it's finished, then you know it's done. Passive scanning happens automatically. So whenever you proxy anything through ZAP, including the spiders, it will always passive scan. The one thing is, this happens in a background thread, and that's good because it means it won't actually slow things down too much, but you will find that for very large applications, it can take a lot of time. And for that reason, you might actually want to poll to see whether it's finished passive scanning, and we've got this numbers of records to scan, so you keep on polling until that finishes. And it looks like I'm taking longer than I expected. So active scanning is very similar, except it will take longer, and that's where polling is much more important. With reporting, again, you can get HTML reports and XML reports, exactly the same by the UI and the API. But you can also actually go in and pull down all of the alerts. So actually go through and find the details. So it's all the underlying data, all the data structures we maintain about the report, the alerts, not just the information available in the alerts. So if you want to report in a different format, I know our reports aren't the prettiest in the world, then you can actually just pull down this data and put it into whatever format you like. And you can also shut down ZAP by the API as well, which is kind of useful, particularly in automation. So authentication, what I'll say is authentication can be really hard. So I definitely recommend doing it via the UI first and exporting things from the UI into files and then importing those. That's a much more effective way. And if you've got complex single sign-on, if you've got an environment, you can disable that. That'll make your life a lot easier. We can cope with anything, but it might get painful for you. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll go through this very quickly. There's lots of things you can do about making ZAP scans faster. That doesn't mean it's going to be blazing fast. It's not going to be down to a few minutes. It's still going to take a while to active scan a large application. But there's loads of different controls, and there's a lot of feedback you can get. We maintain a load of stats so you can see what's going on. And you can tune the accuracy as well. So if you need help, we've got lots of help. We've got a getting started guide. We've got a user guide. We've got user groups, developer groups, lots of information on the wiki, including videos. And we've got an IRC channel on one of the hash websec tools on irc.mozilla.com. Most of the ZAP developers hang out there. So this talk, what I've done is giving you a very easy baseline scan for doing simple security testing, give you an idea of where your application is at. We've got a mass baseline, so you can actually get a dashboard to see a whole range of applications where you are. If you use Jenkins, definitely have a look at the Jenkins plugin for doing more detailed scanning. And the ZAP API gives you a lot more control, full control over ZAP. And if you need help, just ask. So hopefully we've got some time for some questions. So who's got the first question?
Wait, we have a microphone.
Hi, hello. Thank you for the talk. I have a question because I'm a big fan of OWASP Zed, and you can't hear me. So
no.
Okay. Put the headphones on.
Let's see if I can get these on.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for the talk. I'm a big fan of ZAP, but at work, actually, we are using your competition, mostly not because ZAP is worse or something, but mostly it's about documentation. And this is something that really bothers me because I'm fine playing around with ZAP in my free time, but I would just like to sit down, read it all, and know all the things that you just showed us. Yeah, just to in an easy way to. Is there any easy way to get the information?
We've got quite a bit of documentation. We know we could do better. We have all of the talks that I give. If they're recordings, then those are online. All my slides are online. I said we have user guides, we've got user groups and developer groups, but please let us know what documentation you would like. We might be able to point you to existing ones, in which case great. If not, we can try and work on documentation or explain things in the user groups and kind of build up a set of answers that we can actually then use to make the full documentation. When it comes down to it, a lot of people want to contribute. They usually want to contribute code. They don't usually want to contribute documentation. And we're an open source community project, so we want people to, we rely on people contributing, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you.
Hey.
Hey.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Wanted to ask you, I didn't fully understand when you're automating the testing from Jenkins. Do you need to have ZAP running on a separate server and then talk to it via this REST-ish API thingy? Or can you also just do the Docker thing and do like one-off, start it, scan, stop it?
So I'll have to admit, I haven't worked on the Jenkins plugin, so we've got one of the other core team working on that. I don't think it supports Docker yet, so I think you have to have ZAP installed on the Jenkins slave. But I think I've raised an issue for it because I think Docker is great. So I think it'd be really great if it worked with that automatically. Now, I know that Jenkins has Docker plugins, so whether you can use that or not, I'm not sure. But
right, okay. But the current way it's working, you have ZAP running elsewhere, and
you
then
have
you
it
talk to it.
I think you just need it installed. You need it installed, and then it will start and stop it for you.
Ah, okay. So it's not daemon running non-stop. You
No.
start it when you need it to shut it down.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
No problem.
Hi.
Hi.
One question about the. Usually you have your application with authentication about HTTPS. So if you have a Docker, and I know I have ZAP set up, I have taught my browser that it has to accept these application certificates, so does trust in my application still works because it uses HTTPS strict. So for the Docker setup or any Jenkins, how do I teach, can I teach the plugin to actually have this kind of certificate too?
So you require client certificates?
Well, kinda. If it's in the same way the proxy works like ZAP, talks through the proxy via the browser, then I fear yes.
So do you actually have client certificates, or are you just using the service certificate?
The service certificate, yes.
Okay, so ZAP will cope with that anyway, so you don't have to worry about that. If you are proxying browsers through ZAP, then you will need to import the ZAP root CA.
Okay.
But we've actually got a JX browser, which we're now bundling with ZAP, and that actually copes, that trusts the ZAP CA anyway. That's kind of built in.
That would be handy.
Yep, it should all work, so have a play with that. That's one at the back. While the mic's coming round, just mention I do have some ZAP stickers, so if you want one of those, come over and see me afterwards. Or at any point, I'll be around tomorrow as well.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question about this APIs add-on. Will they follow some schema that you upload to API? Could you give them some use cases to test your application, or could you tell us more about how could this API add-on work?
So the API add-on will, what you'll do is you'll give the API add-on a definition, so it'll either be a SOAP or a open API Swagger definition, and it will just be based on that we will actually import the definition, and then we'll start doing the attacks based on that, and the attacks will be tuned for APIs rather than web pages. So at the moment there are no particular kind of use case, you can't specify different ways of using the application, but you can still do proxying. So we will allow you to proxy any of your tests through the API, and I think that's actually better than importing the definition if you've got effective tests.
Okay, thank you.